Please join me in giving Becky Elder a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
I want to preface everything I have to say by giving you a couple of images that I think are important right now as we talk about anything. There is, in the opening scene of Star Wars, Han Solo and Chewbacca walk into this smoky bar, and there's all these odd, foreign things. And they know they're supposed to meet one of those people, one of those creations, and they don't know who it is. So they have to be in and amongst the crowd. They have to ask questions. They have to converse. They have to contact. They have to flow with the community around them. And the second image is the Oklahoma land rush. The Oklahoma land rush must have been one heck of a moment. Shoot the gun, hit the road. You don't know exactly where your stake is or if somebody else has already gotten it. They're in every kind of conveyance. They're every kind of person, but they're going for the future. And I love those two images. They really motivate me to talk to people about where I've been, what I've seen, what I have to offer, and how I can help. I used to go to the committee meetings in Topeka, and still do when I'm invited. And the first thing I always said was, I'm here to help. Good Lord in heaven, I'm Wichita, I'm Kansas, I'm here. I'm here to help, and if it doesn't seem like it right now, let's keep talking. That's the hard part. The hard part is to just keep up the conversation. So I'm going to just start at the beginning, and I'm going to give you the story of an education, which includes a library. My great-grandmother, Eldora Dugan Love, was out in the middle of Douglas around Augusta, and she was in she homesteaded there in a sod hut, like a lot of people did, and not too far into her married life, she was writing articles for a women's magazine in Kansas City. And she was walking it into the Augusta post office, and it was getting up to where it was going. She was getting published. And she was a very common woman. She and I were born on the same day, 80 years apart, and I value that legacy. Her son, Walter Love, was the founder of Love Box Company around 1920, but he was also, here's one place where Jim and I connect again. Jim's grandmother and my grandfather were in a one-room schoolhouse together out there around Douglas, but my grandfather was 17 and he was 19 and Jim's grandmother was 17, and Olive White Garvey, she was the teacher. And it's one of those moments that we can't forget. It's one of those moments we have to remember as we're putting the future together for everybody who's going to be involved. After that, his son, my dad, Bob Love, and mother, there's a great book on it. She was the motivator. He was the executioner, so to speak. And they started Wichita Collegiate School. Like John Todd said, it was behind, you may know if you're in Wichita, Coleman Junior High School is there on 13th. And it was all fields, and there was a little house at the back, and that's where we started. And he didn't know what he was getting into. He just knew that he cared about the outcome of his children's lives, and there was nothing else to do. After that, that birth of collegiate, 1959, 1981, I have a child who needs a school, and Dad is the chairman of the board of Wichita Collegiate School. And the headmaster calls me and says, we have a place for little Bob to come on into school. And I said, Mr. Storms, I've been in your office before on unpleasant terms, and I want to tell you now that my son is not coming. Your school is too far away. And he was speechless. And I thought he might say something like, I'm going to tell your father. And he may have, but my father never said a word. My father, who must have been very disappointed in my decision because it looked really stupid, said, I taught her everything she knows. I taught her everything she knows. Why am I going to complain? And after that, homeschooling, at that time, I have great stories about the SRS showing up at the house and trying to intimidate me, and I invited them in. I said, come on, let's look at this. And they never came back. That doesn't mean they went away, but, you know, I engaged them in conversation, and I think the state of Kansas, the homeschooling community did a great job. They did a great job over the years, and they're absolutely flourishing now. But after homeschooling, there was a point where there were 11 grandchildren, Loves and Elders, and we all homeschooled. We all kind of did it together. And at one point, we said we want to enlarge this community. And Kevin Kimball's son was with us, Brian, in that endeavor. Maybe others of you were there that I haven't quite gotten into focus yet. But we started a school, another school. That makes 4 if you're not counting. And we just did it with what we had and who we were and who was around us. That was it. So that school, Northfield School of the Liberal Arts, is still intact. I'll tell the story now rather than later, but when the company sold in 2006, we were amicably evicted from 30,000 square feet, and we were required within 60 days to move all that we had accumulated over time into someplace else. And I looked around for a while and finally ended up right next door to Friends University, which was a very, very good move. And Kansas Wesleyan, where are you? I need to meet you. Yeah, I need to meet you. And then COVID came, and the school was sent home, but we didn't want to go home. We wanted to be together in some way. So what we did was we contacted everybody and we said, let's see, we got a big problem. COVID's a big problem. It's a big, real problem. And everybody's going to react differently to it. And we don't want to homogenize anything. We don't want to force you or impose anything on you. So we're going to do fear factors. If you're afraid, you go over here with this cohort. If you're ambivalent, you go over here. Make your own rules. Decide what you can live by. And if you're not worried, come with me. We'll go out to the farm and we'll wait it out. And when it was time for everybody to come back together, they didn't want to get back together. They wanted to be together. They just didn't want to have a school together. So we developed LLCs. Each teacher had his own school, had his own students, paid directly, and Northfield remained a 501c3, which raises money and provides some administrative support and location, and let them go to town. And it is doing great. It's one of those people in the Smoky Bar out there with Han Solo. You know, there's just so many forms this thing can take, and we need to let it. I'll get to that in a minute. I wanna talk now. That was kind of the saga. That was the Homeric ode to education. How I got where I was, where I am. But I want to go through how to listen to a conversation, because that was embedded in everything all the time that I ever understood. Mother and Dad were soldiers. Mother was from Hutchinson, and Mr. Carey, Mr. Salt Carey, came to her and said, you play the piano, you have a reputation for cheerful integrity. I'd like for you to join the Red Cross, and I'd like for you to go to Great Malvern, England, and be the point person for activities, encouragement, and uplifting the wounded men in the hospitals. There were 5 hospitals in the middle of the Cotswolds because it was in the middle of the country, and if the Germans were going to find them, we were going to know before they got there. And so Mom went, and she was the activities director for those 5 hospitals from 1942 until 1945. Dad was marching around Europe with Patton's 103rd Infantry. And amazingly, she was from Hutchinson, he was from Wichita, he was wounded in Belgium. He found her. Oh my God. And she had the donut cart. And when he got ambulatory, he had a wound in his leg. When he got ambulatory, she was cute too, and he walked up and said, "I'll help you push the cart," and that was all there was to it. And they came home, and my father said this later in life, but he said what it taught him was that the government had taught him to hate somebody enough that he could kill them. That wasn't him. If any of you ever knew him, his name was love, his motto was love, his actions were that way, but at a certain point in time, he was susceptible to a cause. I'm not going to discuss that, but it bothered him. It bothered him a lot. And the rest of his life was sort of figuring out how to balance between those 2 things. The first thing they were very, very active. You don't be a soldier for very long after a conflict like World War II and all that goes into it without coming home and still being a soldier. It was right to work. We had right to work bumper stickers. Where's Mr. Kimmel? We had bumper stickers. We got hate calls. Dad was up against a guy one night that his name was Lefty Scamacci, and we never believed it. As kids, nah, you're making that up. I found a picture of it. One night they were at a debate. It turned into a brawl. And somebody yelled, "Look out!" And it was my mother with a chair going down to the debate. And she was not gonna relent. And I'm not advocating violence. What I'm telling you is the character of these people. And you just have to take a person where you meet them. And I met them right after the war. They were married in 1945. I was born in 1952. And right to work was happening. Immediately after Right to Work, there was the National Association of Manufacturers. Fred Koch it was W.C. Coleman at that time. Great stories about W.C. Coleman helping Dad meet his payroll on Tuesdays, and when Dad's receivables came in on Friday, Dad would pay Mr. Coleman back. Great stories, a beautiful collaboration. Young man, older men, they took him to the National Association of Manufacturers. And at that time, the Industrial Association was concerned about the well-being of the next generation of people, and they were starting schools. You will read it in my book when I finally get done with 17 or 18 grandchildren. You know, the industrial world was motivated to make sure that good schools really happened. And there was a proliferation of small schools, like collegiate school at that time. Willard Garvey was probably right on the cusp of that entire conversation if he wasn't in the room. I don't know that yet, Jim. We'll find out. So Right to Work, National Association of Manufacturers. Then Mr. Koch, Fred Koch, took Dad and Charles, and they started down the John Birch Society, ultra-conservative, really. It's kept me out of a lot of places. I mean, they didn't want my legacy when they found out that was involved. Dad and Charles finally left the John Birch Society over the Vietnam War after a long conversation. But it was a very politically charged time. The Vietnam War is what finally took them out. And then after that, the Institute for Humane Studies out in California with a man named Baldy Harper, who was talking about humane studies. He was talking about how do we make ourselves human again? What's that going to be like? We've been through a war. We're going through another one. We seem to have a bad cycle. Can we break it? And of course, that was free markets. And the offshoot of that were people like a gentleman who started the Freedom School. His name's escaping me right now. George. Yeah, Bob LaFave. And he was out in Colorado all by himself, but he attracted attention because he was starting a school. He was starting a school. Just people need schools. People need education. And they do it in schools. And after the Freedom School, there was the Foundation for Economic Education with a guy named Leonard E, who was as elegant and winsome and deliberate about his articulations of the free market that he was almost irresistible, really, even for his adversaries. He was almost irresistible. And he took the Foundation for Economic Education from 0 to 70 in his lifetime. Dad was the president in 1987. George was explaining that to me, how Dad filled in the gap. He walked into the gap, still a soldier. And at the end of his life, stricken by Parkinson's, God became very, very important, of course. He'd been important, but he became primary, and the last lessons that he taught us were those about dependence upon what is. That was God, dependent upon what is. And I tell you that chronology to tell you that my life was a huge conversation. My parents were provident enough, the people that we were associated with, the families that were around us, the community of Wichita was talking about it. They were talking about it. Now, I'll come forward into the images that motivate me right now while I'm trying to put this library together, and I'll tell you the story of the library. But 3 images. You know how these things lodge in your mind when you're a child and you're walking through whatever you're walking through and your peripheral vision grabs something and all of a sudden it's in your mind? The first image, the first library image for me, beyond having learned the great conversation, was in Mr. Fred Koch's home. I'm sure it's Mr. Charles Koch's home now. And one time I was in that house, and the first room that they left me in while they were going to go talk was a library. And it was a huge, for me, I don't know how tall it is. Maybe it's not 6 stories tall. But for me, it was huge. And there was a rail all around it. And there was a ladder. And you could not only read books, you could climb a ladder and read books. And that never, ever left. It never left. Isn't that fun? And then beyond that, Mr. Koch's ladder, there was the image of my own father reading. Now remember, when he went to war, he was 18 years old. The story I get to tell now, because he's not here to stop me and Mother won't correct me, is he got drunk. He was a Phi Delt at KU in October. He had just barely turned 18. His whole pledge class, right after Pearl Harbor, went and enlisted. And he called my grandmother, who was a formidable lady, Nana. And he said, "Mom, I'm going to camp." And she said, "Bob, don't be ridiculous. It's October." He said, "Pendleton." And she fell silent. And she knew that he was not going to finish his education. He was not going to meet old, wonderful opportunities that were in store for him, that his parents had hoped for. He was going to war. And Dad suffered from that. He regretted that, not so much as a soldier, but, he did not read. And so one of my images is of him coming home at the end of the day, taking off his shoes and socks, going to a shelf, getting a book, and presiding over our homework and reading. And he was reading, as John Milton advises, promiscuously. He was reading many kinds of things because he'd missed it. And that was a very odd thing when I was little, but it's a very beautiful thing now. That this man who had not taken the time, he had not taken the opportunity, was running double time to catch up. After he had started collegiate, he had started the box company. He was very busy, but it was important enough that he sat with us and he modeled for us reading. And the last image that I wanted to bring forward, the image, is a gentleman named Russell Kirk. And maybe some of you know the name Russell Kirk. He wrote the seminal volume on the conservative mind, and that was not a political term. It was a term of action, how we conserve things. And Russell Kirk's widow, Annette, is still running the Russell Kirk Cultural Center in Mecosta, Michigan, and I was privileged to go there about 10 years ago and meet her and spend time in his library, which is an entire house. And it could have felt like a tomb, because they were very dark, quiet rooms, you know, like libraries can be. But I could hear the conversation. Oh, Lord, could I hear it? And I was just, okay, I got to remember this. I got to do something about it later. And and maybe the last thing, and again, it's poignant, as at the time Collegiate was started, when Mother and Dad were moving away from the status quo, her brother, Pat Thiessen, who was an attorney here in town, he actually was the head of Cargill after Ross Industries, which was a prominent Wichita milling company, family company, merged with Cargill. He was their international liaison, and he was all over the world. But at the time, 1959, when Collegiate was emerging, he happened to be USD 259 Board of Education chair. And you would have thought you needed to call the police some nights when they got going, brother and sister. And they went at it, they talked about it, they disagreed on it, but they loved each other. And that was huge. As a little girl, I was like, whoa, so should you go in there and say something to him, Randy, my older brother? No, we're all gonna watch. So we learned. Our parents were open, they were forceful, they were defined, but they loved us. The relationships they built were that same way. So now you get to know why I'm doing a library. Well, I'm not doing in a library. The library is doing me, and it's an appointment I have to keep with it. The way this library, which is called now the Sunnydale Community Library, if you know your geography north of town, the introduction had, you know, last paved road in Sedgwick County is 101st Street North. We're someplace between, we're fought over between amongst Kechi, Valley Center, Park City, Sedgwick County. Nobody really knows who we are, so we kind of exist. We exist as Grant Township and in the Sunnydale community, which is not incorporated, but man, is it there. It's a 5-generation farming community that's now becoming residential, and that's where the books are going. When Northfield had to move so quickly, we just took the books, and at that time there were about 8,000 of them. We just took them and put them in a little church building that was out there in Sunnydale, and had to wait 10 years now to decide what to do, but that's what we're doing. We're taking those volumes that are in that place and have been waiting for attention, and we're turning it into a library. And what's important is that it was peaceful, incremental, quiet work. It was not a big decision. It was resourcefulness. Again, all the pieces were there. You couldn't quite see how they were going to fit, but as time and circumstance presented themselves, COVID being part of it, and I'm going to speak about the school starter movement I'm involved in right now too, which brings us to Dr. Tooley's visit in April. But it was time to give that library a presence. It was time to give it a way to breathe, to inhabit the community around us. That community is growing, like I said. Amazon has a 15-block installation out there, Integra, if any of you are keeping track of how we're taking back the computer chip production from the Chinese. The Integra plant is going at Rock and 254. And so there's going to be 55,000 houses in Kechi, not just in Wichita like there were in 1952. It's growing, and I want to be there. I want to be there with this new thing. So the library is now around 10,000 volumes. Part of those volumes, I said, were very quietly accumulated. The first collection that we were given was when the Foundation for Economic Education was transitioning. Leonard E had died, and they were trying to decide whether to stay put in New York at Irvington-on-Hudson or whether to move to the mover and shaker capital of the entire world, Atlanta. And so they hadn't they hadn't connected all the dots yet, but what they knew was they needed to, clean house. So books from Fee started coming, signed copies by Leonard Reed, and that was like cotton candy to a kid at Joyland. And we put them in boxes, we put them in the basement, we put them out on a shelf eventually, and now they need fuller explanation. They need a fuller opportunity to make their own explanation in the great conversation that is going on. And so at this moment, we belong to Jubilee Church. It was an equipment shed on 40 acres. We bought the equipment shed on 40 acres. We sold 30 acres, and we remodeled the equipment shed. And some days, kind of like a hen house, it still smells like an equipment shed. But we're going to build something. And you've been looking at this, so there it is. That's all it is. And the fun thing is, as we were deciding about how to house it, we started to think the simultaneous thoughts of what would be an appropriate architecture. Of course, I wanted a cathedral. I've always wanted a cathedral. I would take the Bodleian Library if it were for sale or offered at the right price. But look what I got. It's going to be 4 metal containers. Cargo, you know what I'm talking about. And I told that to my architect son, George. He's not an architect, he's an architectural snob, who studied a lot of John Ruskin. He said, "Mom, you can't do that. That's awful." I said, "I think it's perfect. I think it's recycling, and it's one of its huge pinnacles." And so it's going to be 4 containers connected with a roof. Later, if things go well, maybe I'll get my bell tower. But for sure, there's going to be trees and trees and trees and gardens and all the things that go with a good experience, a good meditative experience, a good encounter with the fullness of the world that God made for us to inhabit. There'll be books. There'll be those 10,000 books. There'll be more. I'll shove them in there, and it'll get too small too quickly. But I got to start with something, and I got to get it done. I got to get it done. That's the attitude that my parents gave me. We have the opportunity. We have the resources. We have the ability. We got to get it done. And remember, all this is underpinned not by the force of law, not by financed imposters or things that will cost me more than I can possibly pay. It's going to get done by a bunch of people who want to help get it done. That's community. That's what we got to get back to. 1952, little Becky is born into Wichita, 55,000 houses. Rotary meets once a week. I went to Rotary in almost every state in the union. Wherever we were on Monday at 4 o'clock or at noon, Dad went to Rotary. We're going back, you guys. We're going back, and we're going to remember the world that was us. And it's not going to be the same world. We got to bring all the experiences with us. We got to bring all the conflicts with us. We got to bring everything with us. But what I like about a library I love the conversation. I had a fabulous education. I've had a fabulous life. I thank God and my parents and my husband and you guys and everybody that's been involved in it. But what has to happen now is that we have to give back. And this is going to be, it's going to take a lot more energy than I have. So I'll be organizing. I'll be talking to as many people as will invite me and want to hear. But I want to leave you this afternoon with the concept that all of this started, all of this very small moment started because people talked together. They talked together vigorously. And what I like about a library is when you walk in, that conversation is in that place, and it's going on. But they stay on the shelves, right? They don't jump out at you, sometimes like Grandpa did out of his rocking chair when his son and daughter were arguing over public education. I love that we have an opportunity to share something beautiful and in an orderly fashion that can turn your soul upside down, an idea, a story, a moment, an encounter with Robin Hood or Socrates or Leonard Reed or just so many titles and so many names and so much collected. But none of it is hostile if you go with the Han Solo Chewbacca syndrome. I gotta find you. I gotta find you. And we'll be fine. I hope I survive this. I look at those books sitting on those shelves and I go, every one of them's gotta be moved. And we'll get around to it sooner or later. The building, this is really great, it's being envisioned and constructed by Clinic in a Can. If any of you remember Hospitals of Hope 30 years ago, it was right down the street from Love Box Company on Santa Fe, and a couple of guys who one of them was medical and one of them was construction. They started sending little containers, outfitting them as hospitals and sending them all over the world. And they finally kind of got noticed, and they moved over to 53rd and Webb, and now it's called Clinic in a Can. They still do that, but they also have enlarged their business to where they build the containers into, you've seen, what is it up there, Fusion, there's a couple of them with great windows on Central. Revolution. So you see some of the potential and capacities, and they're working with us. And I said, you got to be careful not to spend more than I got. And he said, well, you guys were kind to us. You were kind to us when we were down there. And he said, we'll be kind to you. And I said, thumbs up. Okay, thank you. So that's it. That's a story. It's called the Sunnydale Community Library. We got a little website, suncomlib.com, and you can start reading about why people read. That's what's on there right now. This story will be on there eventually, and stay tuned. It's certainly getting started, but it's not over, and anybody who's interested in talking, furthering my great conversation, I entertain the acquaintance, and I certainly can talk. So thank you all very, very much. Okay. The guy in the blue shirt is passing it.
Thanks, May, for being here. Will you accept donations to the library?
Oh. I accept donations to the library, yes, right here in this pocket. I do.
How about books?
Yeah, books, I have to do the caveat with the books that if you give me books, they're my books. And if you want your books back for your library, great, do it. One thing I did forget to mention is my inspiration is a guy in Yuma, Arizona, who has what's called the Freedom Library. His name is Howard Blitz. How would you love to have that name, Howard Blitz? And he has programming, great programming. You can get on your internet, and you can look for the Freedom Library in Yuma, Arizona. He's right now conducting 10 classes a week. He's got adult classes, he's got private schools, public schools, he's got after schools, he's got scholarships where they're writing essays, but that's my inspiration for the programming that can come out of the library. Yeah.
Would you explain a little bit the opportunity we have at Friends University on the 26th of April?
Well, Dr. James Tooley is part of this vision. I can't remember who met him first, but George Pearson knew him. And so we said, George, could you get Dr. Tooley to come from Buckingham, England to Wichita, Kansas? And he said, I'll try. And it just so happened that Dr. Tooley was actually coming to Kennesaw State University, where he does an annual conference on school starting, small schools, low cost, high caliber private schools. And so we detoured Dr. James Tooley to come be with us for one full day on April 26th. Friends University has very, very generously given us facilities without cost. We've tried to involve the heads of all their departments, so not only the people who would be prone to come and listen, but the people who are learning about the world around them, the students and the faculty. So we've made a time. On the flyer, it shows the schedule of events. He'll be doing a morning where he's just trying to talk about why school is an enterprise. Why would we turn it into a business? And there's a couple really good explanations. And then there's an afternoon panel discussion about the difference between education and schools and what schools are going to look like in the future, because costs are it's too much. I'm sorry, I have a son at Baylor University who you invited before to speak to this group. He's been there 7 years now. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place. But his constant comment is, we're changing. We're going to have to adapt. There's things happening that we can't stop from happening. And if we're going to continue, higher education is going to adapt. Everybody's going to adapt. We're going to figure it out. Let's do it together rather than alone. So Dr. Tooley will be bringing those concepts to us. There's going to be a great panel discussion in the middle of the day. And I would encourage you, if you like doing, if you like listening and you like being provoked, we've got liberals and Democrats. We've got Russ McCullough from the Gwartney Institute up at Ottawa University is coming down. We've got people from the Land Institute starting to talk about family as ecosystems. This is a big, wonderful opportunity for us to kind of, just, are you there? Are you there? Are you thinking? So come, if you can, pick up a flyer and call me. Yes?
I want to come to that. Do they have anybody from here? Oh, I'm sorry.
Here's,
Ma'am, if somebody doesn't understand the book on time, do you post fine? If so, how much?
what did he say?
Do you find books?
If somebody doesn't return the book in time.
You are so, why would I be practical at this euphoric moment? If it's you, no, I won't charge a fine. That is so funny.
So Becky, the speakers at the event at Friends, who are some of the liberals and do we have people from public education involved in that?
Well,
That's an awesome thing to bring everybody together, if we can all sit down together.
Yeah, well, they're invited. There's a new USD 259 super coming on board, and I'm reading that he's open to discussion because he's inheriting a really tough place, right? A failing place, and he doesn't want it to fail. And when you get to that point in life, sometimes you take suggestions from places that you don't ordinarily think about. So they're invited. The entire Board of Education is coming, and that's good. That's pretty exciting. I think there's 6 of them. But the panelists right now are, of course, Dr. Tooley. And one of the big things about him is He's been called the Indiana Jones, which I love for my metaphors, you know. He's the Indiana Jones of the educational experience in the United States, in the world, because he went to Zimbabwe and he went to India, and he saw the schools that all those people who are sending their children over here to our universities were educated in, and they were on street corners, and they were a parent-teacher relationship to get that kid through at a low-cost, high-caliber experience. These people are poor. There's great stories about the poor doing what's right at whatever it costs and figuring it out. And sometimes in an affluent society, when we can have what we want, we lose that habit. That's what a discussion is about. It just shakes you to hear somebody say something you don't like. And you aren't going to be able to conflict. You have to converse. And when you have to converse, the wheels start moving. And all of a sudden, the wheels start moving, not just about the confrontation, but about the solutions. And you start saying, I can do this, and I can do this, and you can do this. And then conversation becomes collaboration, and collaboration becomes culture. And in a good culture, good things happen. So we have so many opportunities in front of us, because it's the worst of times, the very best of times, to quote Charles Dickens.
Back here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Becky, for being here at the Pachyderm. Are you familiar with the gentleman named Dr. Jordan Peterson?
Whoa, who's not now? I mean, he's everywhere.
Are you familiar with his concept or his idea that the brick and mortar school is no longer going to be, and the school building is going to be right here, you know, on your phone? Do you agree with that, or do you disagree? And then I've got another fun question.
Well, there's the two terms we need to talk about: education and school. And I'm never going to advocate for a school that's exclusively online. I'm not going to advocate against it. I'm going to say that parents and children are going to figure out what they can tolerate. Parents, children, and teachers are going to figure out what they can do. It may mean a displacing of standards as we have them now. It may mean a loss of credentialing and accreditation as we have it now. But in a tsunami, a lot of things get washed away that will be reestablished in some way or another. We cannot be afraid of his suggestion, but neither do I have to embrace it.
Okay, now for the fun question. Do you remember a primary reader that was real popular in America by the title of Anything Can Happen? In fact, maybe some people in the room, you remember a book in first grade, second grade, called Anything Can Happen?
I was still Dick and Jane.
Well, okay, well, that's the same era, same thing, David and Ann. Okay. It's possible now through the used bookstores to get those, and there's nothing like what I call unintended history. And you know, looking at a book I hadn't read in 60 years.
Fabulous.
And to turn back and look at it, look at the history from the angle of an adult. So anyway, my mom always says never throw away a book. You know, the older they get, the better.
I know her. That's all. Yeah.
All right. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, it's the one person that I adore, I turned back to over and over, was a gentleman named John Gatto. John Gatto was the New York City Teacher of the Year 2 years in a row, and then he was the New York State Teacher, and he was in Carnegie Hall accepting his award in his tuxedo, and he told him, "I quit because you're killing children." And it was a big moment in the consciousness of the educational elite that we haven't convinced everybody just to follow. And John Gatto spent the next 45 years, he died 5 years ago at 80 years old, saying, if your child doesn't get on a school bus, don't make him get on the school bus. Take him home. Love him a little longer. Talk to him a little more. Read with him a whole lot. And he, for me, was that kind of an establishment renegade that had tremendous credibility. And I was glad, very privileged to have met him and spent time with him. And he wrote some wonderful things about the history of compulsory education. And we won't go there because we're talking about libraries.
Becky, thank you. I'd like to get an idea in terms of, you talked about books in general, but are there specific types of books that this library is going to focus on? And roughly how big a capacity once you get your initial construction compared to however many books you have today? Ballpark idea?
Well, at 10,000 volumes, and that's not an exact count, we're just think 4 containers that are 10 feet wide and 40 feet long, and they have bookshelves everywhere and a couple of great windows. I mean, the capacity, I got to get it done. And I got to get it started. Let's put it that way. I'm going to get it started. And then there is the option to enlarge or add to. The good thing is that once we get all those books out of the church and into whatever we're going to be able to build, the church will, it'll have capacity to be a fellowship hall again. Right now, it's a library way station. But I'd love to focus on the programming. I'd love to bring lots of different kinds of programming to get people involved in the library. The assumption, as you can tell, will be that people can do good things. That's the free market. That's a free market philosophy translated into sociology. People can do good things. We were observing that. People can also do rotten things, but we aren't going to let that stop us. You know, we're going to go forward with what we can start with, and we're going to build on it, and that's the way every great enterprise has happened. But let me say one big word: decentralize. I love that Kansas Wesleyan is here today. I have a great respect for the academy. I have a tremendous respect for the small college. I believe that that is one of the most underused, under-tapped resources that we have in this country. And I'd like to see every one of them given the opportunity to start a school right next to it, a K through 16 if that's what we want to be. But don't make kids spend too much time in school, or else they might be like hard-boiled eggs.
You could give us your perspective on school choice in Kansas. I know you've made a lot of efforts in that regard. Wade Moore, who's spoken here, has made some efforts in that regard. Where do you think the state stands now? What can we do to help move along?
Well, you can say what you mean, and you can say it to your legislature, and if they don't do what you want, you can go do what you want. And it's a part of the story. It's a part of the story. Of course, I come from extreme libertarian siblings, and they don't want vouchers, and they don't want education savings accounts. They want to do it yourself the whole way. But I was a mom, and I know that new things need nurturing, and so I'm not opposed. I just want to make sure that we have the capacity to hold on. It's not wrong. There's nothing wrong except the human heart makes it wrong. We have to understand what's good, and we have to go forward. And at this point in the battle or the contest or the conversation, we just need to be at it. We need to be there. I think lots of people hurt so badly. One of the things that James Tooley says that I think is incredibly prophetic, and it's based on a lot of research. He says in 25 years, we're going to look back and say the system that we had, based on compulsory education, basically, may have been barbarous, what we did to kids. There was a great book, and one of you will remember the 12-year sentence about the incarceration of children in the compulsory school system. And he takes off on that quite a bit. I don't know if we'll actually get there because we're talking about enterprise as opposed to compulsory education. But that certainly was, I believe that we have to just be there. I believe Topeka is a place you got to go, and you got to want to go, and you got to be involved. And if your argument is better, if you are thinking about what is happening from every direction and you can develop a better argument, That's going to work. The end of the story is not the end of the story until something really good happens. So there's not an end to this story. And I would like education savings account, and I said that for James Franco at the Kansas Policy Institute.
Big round of applause for Becky Elder. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Don't forget to